Hello, everyone. My name is Mick, and for the first 10 years of my career, I was an open source developer and a programming language researcher. And I just thought we could code our way out of every single problem. So I was working on programming languages that would connect everyone in the organization, that would make it more easy to express business concerns right up until deployment. But I learned as I was doing that these problems that we're trying to solve are actually much more complex than the code. And as you heard Erez say, they actually span multiple silos, and it's not only around developers. So I did a lot of research in terms of what it'd be like to apply some of the things that we learned in open source to really scaling things in enterprise IT, in code bases that got very large, and organizations where you had many developers, but not just developers. You had testers, you had business analysts, you had designers. And I realized that we were getting into the limitations of programming languages. So I was working on things like intentional programming, which were meant to make it easy for business people to express things in PowerPoint-like tools that would just generate code and not involve any developers or testers, but those things just really weren't working. So when I did my PhD and to try to better understand how we could take some of the concepts of programming languages and make them apply to these end-to-end value streams. So value streams are the way that we deliver value through software to our end users, to our customers, to the people that we want to delight with great software. And with that, I started this company called TaskTop to try to research that and try to basically take my PhD work and understand how these things could work in a commercial context. So while I was doing that, I started traveling a lot. I started meeting with a lot of business leaders in very large organizations who were trying to go through these agile transformations at the time. This started about 10 years ago. And I collected some of these learnings into this thing that's now called the Flow Framework. So today I'm going to give you an overview of the Flow Framework, of this journey of how I went from writing over 1 million lines of code as a developer, which was really fun and interesting, to flying over 1 million air miles, which is not fun and a lot less interesting. But the meetings that I had from these hundreds of different organizations I spoke with taught me a lot in terms of what's hard about scaling software delivery, what's hard about scaling Agile, what's hard about scaling DevOps that might be a lot easier in a tech company or even in a tech giant that's grown up digital. But it's very difficult as companies try to transform and become digital innovators. And really, the stark difference that I experienced between things being about 100 times easier to do in small-scale Agile and small-scale teams to what I was really seeing in terms of this tremendous lack of productivity with software delivery at scale. So I'll tell you the story where I really first experienced this huge difference between the amazing productivity and flow that you feel as a developer on an open source project and then what I was really seeing in the enterprise. And this was an organization, if you remember back to 2007, that was the exact phone that I had, and this was a beautiful phone. This was the Nokia 6300. The company was Nokia, and this company found out about a year before we all did that there was something coming called the iPhone. So they learned about this a year before, in 2006. And as soon as they learned this, they realized that their future was at stake because they had gotten very good at manufacturing phones with beautiful stainless steel physical buttons. But as soon as those phones were going to have a bigger screen, and Nokia realized that there was a capacitive touch screen coming and the user experience would change, the experience would become much more digital because all of a sudden, you're no longer interacting with buttons, you were interacting with a digital surface. You were interacting with a software-based experience. So Nokia started taking their digital transformation very, very seriously. For TAS, that was actually our first big enterprise deal, to take some of the open source technologies I'd worked on in my PhD and try to apply them to help Nokia's Agile transformations, to really connect Nokia's developers to the Agile tools they were using, and to really bridge some of the silos, as Erez said earlier. As I was seeing this rollout at Nokia, so they were trying to adopt the best Agile tools, they really had the whole organization behind the Agile transformation. So they brought in the best consultants. Dean Leffingwell, the father of the Scaled Agile Framework, was there. Ken Schwaber was there, the creator of Scrum. They really became the poster child of how you did Agile at scale. And I'll never forget my first time at the Agile 2009 conference. It was my first time to the original Agile conference, where I walked from room to room, and there was always a consultant saying, here's proof that Agile works perfectly at scale because it works at Nokia. Now, I was actually working with people at Nokia who were saying very different things about Agile at scale at Nokia, and they were saying that this is not solving any of their problem. So they were meant to be delivering a brand new experience. They're meant to be delivering an app store in this phone and these new sets of widgets and this new operating system and capability, but they couldn't do it. And meanwhile, the board of directors, the CEO, all thought that doing the Agile transformation was actually putting them on track to becoming the software innovator, to transitioning from being a hardware and manufacturing innovator to a software innovator. They developed something called the Nokia test for agility, but it was actually developed by Nokia Siemens Networks. And that test was based on whether you were trained on Scrum, whether you were adopting the creation of user stories and your Agile tool and so on. And according to this Nokia test for agility, Nokia was agile. And the board of directors thought that they were agile, and leadership thought that they were agile. But this wasn't the case at all. So it turns out that if we actually look at it right now, and we think of these end-to-end value streams of basically taking business initiatives and the value that you want to deliver to your end users, and turning that into running code, Nokia had done a local optimization of the value stream so that they became agile just in the middle, just where the developers were, adopted all the agile tools and trained everybody on Scrum, but nothing was flowing to their customers any faster. So these features, these things that were going to differentiate them with the iPhone coming just around the corner, these features weren't flowing. And scaling Agile, they could have hired 10 more Dean Leffingwells and 20 more Ken Schwabers, and I actually think they could have doubled the number of developers they had, and they would not have gone any faster. Because it turns out their problem wasn't in that really narrow aspect of Agile, it was an end-to-end problem. And they had a fundamental architecture problem as well, in that the Series 40 and Series 60 operating systems simply could not scale to that kind of screen and to those kinds of features that they were trying to deliver. They had a mountain of technical debt in this platform, and no one was listening to the engineers at the time saying, we simply cannot innovate in this way without having a chance to take down some of that technical debt to invest some of that architecture. So what was so fascinating is that the entire time that the leadership of Nokia thought that they were on track to becoming a software innovator and creating this poster child of an agile transformation, they were actually falling further and further behind, and behind a company who could innovate on software. And they actually end up losing the entire agile market, mobile market that they created. So it wasn't until Steven Elop came in from Microsoft, they realized they were standing on a burning platform, and the rest was history. But there was a really interesting lesson for me around this, because I realized that the way that they were measuring software delivery at a business level was completely disconnected from what the software developers were actually seeing. Software developers, there were actually some whistleblowers who went straight to the board and said, we can't build what you want on this operating system. We need time to refactor, to replatform this operating system to do that. But they wouldn't listen to because everything looked like it was on track. And this idea of these silos and just measuring things in silos, how agile are we right here? How is work looking like today in Jira? And these proxy metrics of how many people have we trained on Scrum, these things actually derail and destroy digital transformations. And that was back in 2007. Now another story from 2016. So this is a large bank. These stories, by the way, they're detailed in the book, Project to Product. This is this bank's third transformation, and this one looks like it's going to be much, much better because now it's not just an agile transformation, it's agile with DevOps. So it's definitely going to work this time. And what's fascinating about this transformation is it had a $1 billion budget for the transformation itself, in addition to the IT budget of this organization. So what's been happening is, as software continues eating the world, the IT budgets at these large companies have just grown and grown. You've got organizations such as the largest banks will have over 90,000 IT staff today. So the budgets are tremendous. And it's just the numbers of people working in IT. For example, Kathy Bassant, the CIO at Bank of America, she's got over 90,000 staff rolling up to her. The consequences are tremendous, and so there's a lot of desire to become a software innovator, especially when you've got things like Apple releasing the Apple Card and potentially getting you even further away from that digital customer experience that you really need to own. So what was really interesting about this transformation is, once again, it all looked like everything was on track. is being managed as a project. All IT work, in fact, as it usually is in enterprise IT, was managed as projects. And what was, again, fascinating is that 2 years later, when I was interviewing the people, some of them were executives who were part of the transformation, who had actually exited. Some of them were still there. The consensus was that IT was delivering even less than before the transformation started. And the transformation was also marked a success. So the way it was managed was as a set of projects, and the projects were on time and on budget. And one of the main success, actually the main success criteria for the transformation was that it was a cost reduction over the previous IT budget. So the cost reduction succeeded, but a lot less value was delivered at the end of it, because managing these transformations, managing IT as a cost center, turns out just to be the completely wrong model for reasons you'll learn about in just a moment. So the second epiphany that's detailed in the book is that this project management cost centers, they're the wrong managerial tool for helping you transform to become a digital innovator. They help you manage the cost, they help you manage to timeframes and budgets, and they help you treat people like interchangeable cogs on a wheel. They do not really help you become a software innovator. And it's just fascinating to see what happens when you've got a company. So this is the stock price change in retail, in the retail market in the US, between 2006 and 2016. One of these companies does not manage its IT and software delivery as a set of projects and cost centers. It manages them as profit centers. It has its software architecture with microservices aligned to its organizational structure with two pizza teams aligned to its product value streams. And you can see that becoming a software innovator has allowed it to completely disrupt an entire industry. And it's actually now going to be able to disrupt other industries. Whereas those companies, the other companies there, by the way, almost all of them have been going through agile transformations. They just haven't been doing very well at those. And their stock prices are stagnating at best. They're now going through DevOps transformations as well, but they've not been able to innovate at anywhere near this pace. And this world of these haves and have-nots in software transformations and digital transformations is just widening and widening. So at the current pace, half of the S&P 500, one of the main stock indices in the US, half of those companies will be replaced over the next 10 years because of how quickly some companies are mastering software delivery and how quickly others are falling behind, others are failing to master those practices at scale. So as I was doing the research for Project to Product, I got to wondering, has this kind of shift ever happened before, where we had this many companies falling this far behind, and then such a small number of companies basically innovating so quickly that they're owning more and more of the world's economy at this incredible pace. And Gene Kim introduced me to the work of Dr. Carlota Perez, who in 2002 wrote a book called Technological Revolutions and Financial Capital. And she outlined in this book these 5 distinct technological revolutions. So the Industrial Revolution, Age of Steam and Railways, Age of Steel and Heavy Engineering, Age of Oil and Mass Production, when we learned how to make those phones, the feature phones, and then the Age of Software and Digital. And these revolutions happen approximately every 50 years. And what's so interesting about Dr. Perez's theories is that she actually indicates that they all happen in 2 distinct phases. So there's the installation period, where some new means of production becomes very cheap. So Henry Ford learns how to create a production line for cars, an assembly line for cars, and all of a sudden car production becomes very cheap. And then just years down the road, you now have over 300 car startups in Detroit in the early 1900s. Because all this financial capital, all the venture capitalists and similar investment vehicles want to make a 10x return or greater on basically owning part of that future. And so you have this frenzy. Then you actually have this turning point. Those things tend to be associated with recessions. And then you have this deployment period. And in the deployment period, what happens is that this new means of production gets mastered by the rest of the economy. So it's no longer just Henry Ford or a small number of car companies who can manufacture cars. We now have a pretty rich ecosystem of cars and suppliers, and mass production is just a part of the economy. And that's when production capital takes over. That's when the venture capitalists are actually less strong in driving innovation. The innovation curve, the technology diffusion's happened, And other companies, basically the whole economy, learns how to master this new means of production. So this has happened 4 times already. And according to Dr. Perez and all the research I've done for the book, we're actually in the midst of the turning point. So we're moving now from the spirit of creative destruction, where you have hundreds or thousands of startups in each industry sector, into a turning point where you've got some companies who have mastered the new means of production at scale. And now the question is, how do we bring those companies that have been established before this age of software into this period of wealth generation? How do we exit the turning point? And to really do that, the rest of the economy needs to become software innovators. So we can kind of end up with one of 2 worlds. Either the tech giants that we have today, they take over more and more of the economy, or, and we never get into this deployment period, into this golden age, or other companies learn how to master software delivery at scale. And today, we're in an interesting point because if you take the FANGs there, the US tech giants, the BATs, so Baidu, Tencent, and Alibaba, from China, you actually have an economy, a GDP, the size of Japan, the 3rd largest in the world. That's how much of a wealth imbalance there is because of these masters of software delivery. So what was so interesting to me in examining this work further is that each of these technological revolutions has brought with it some kind of managerial revolution. So we've had factory systems, subcontracting. In the age of steel and heavy engineering, we learned project management and Taylorism. So we learned how to build dams and learned how to basically break things out into projects and Gantt charts and so on, build large buildings and such. And what was really such a stark realization for me is that the companies like Nokia, a lot of today's banks, today's healthcare companies, today's governments, they're still using that old managerial technology to manage software innovation, and it just does not work. So I want to take a look at this firsthand and to see how a company, and in this case it's BMW Group, had actually transitioned in the last age, how they survived the turning point in the age of mass production. They just happened to be one of our largest customers, so they invited me for a 2-day tour of their flagship plant. This is the BMW Leipzig plant in Germany. And this plant was just nothing short of spectacular. So there's a long thread in the book of the walk through this plant and the production lines, but basically every 70 seconds, there's a new 1 or 2 series car that's released off the plant. That basically drives off the plant. There are over 30,000 suppliers globally that BMW Group manages. It's all just-in-time inventory, so all the parts are delivered to the exact section of the plant where they're used, the exact section of the production line where they're used. And one of the main things I realized is that the complexity that plant is managing in this elegant way actually rivals the complexity that we see in enterprise IT. Rivals the fact that we're getting close to billion line of code systems. They've managed to master this kind of complexity and to actually have full transparency and visibility and control over it, as well as a culture that fosters innovation. So the really fascinating thing about the plant, I was really trying to look at not just how production works in the plant, but really how production's managed, how the business sees production, because I was realizing that's one of the biggest disconnects that we have. People talk about transparency in software. You can't go tell your CFO to look at your Jira tickets. Well, you can. It just doesn't work that well, it turns out, because I've tried. I also tried to tell my CFO about story points, and that didn't work out well for me either. So, but what was so interesting is the way that at a business level, they look at production and the kinds of production metrics they look at. And this, more than anything I've seen, embodies lean principles. So these are the lean principles from Jim Womack's books. I'll just restate them here. Precisely specify value by product, identify the value stream for each product, make value flow without interruptions, and let the consumer pull value from the producer. So in this plant, there's no talk of Gantt charts or screens with telemetry of Gantt charts on them or cost centers. Everything, including the entire architecture of the building, the interior and exterior layout, is about these lean principles. Products and value streams and pull and flow. And I think a lot of us already think this way about the way that we build software, but it just happens to be that this is not really the way that we architect software often. And this is not the way that the business funds and looks at investing in software. And if you look at, again, the BMW plant, everything is architected around those value streams. So here you're seeing the plant from space. If you look up there, you can see these buildings that kind of look, they call it the hand. They look like a bit like a hand with a thumb at the bottom. That's the 1 and 2 series line. So this is the high automation line. This thing is many, many kilometers long, and it's all around repeatability. Over on the top right there, you actually have the i8 and the i3. So these were BMW's response to Tesla that they had to bring to market very quickly. This assembly line, this production line, is actually optimized for learning because it turns out this was a really surprising thing to me. The i8 line is only the width of that building, so it's maybe 100th the length of a 1 series line because the steps are actually made by generalists and there's a lot more learning involved. BMW's done experiments where a single team builds and supports a car when they really want to optimize for learning. So everything is optimized around that particular value stream for that particular customer. And the contrast with what I saw there and what we see in enterprise IT is just incredible. So in terms of car production, everything is around these integrated production lines. Meanwhile, in enterprise IT, we have these disconnected tool chains. We have the business people using different tools from development, using different tools from UX, using different tools from the support desk. That concept within car production would be completely foreign. They've got different suppliers, and they've got hundreds of them supplying parts to the plant, but everything's about integration and flow. Everything there is managed as products, so long-lived products that you're continually investing in. If you set up a line, you're basically going to manage that line for its life cycle rather than have a discrete end and having it go into maintenance mode. In IT, things are managed as projects, so they have a beginning and an end, they go into maintenance. And it just so happens that does not work for innovation and production. Everything at that plant is architected around flow, whereas in enterprise IT, we architect as technology layers. So we think of the persistence layer, we think of the presentation layer, and so on. It's very different if you're architecting for flow. You think very different, you make very different decisions if you're architecting for what your current flow is, what your future flow should be. Everything is optimized end to end. And whereas in enterprise IT, we tend to optimize in silos. We think of how many story points were delivered. We think of the number of deploys per day. Well, it turns out those are all proxy metrics. Those are not end-to-end metrics. So the BMW plant has this notion of cycle times, which is the times each step takes. They do not optimize the cycle times because automotive manufacturers know that lead time, the time it takes from customer order to delivered car, is the #1 predictor of car company performance. So the revenue performance of the car company. Because in car manufacturing, everything is measured in terms of business results. Again, not these proxy metrics on how long a step took, but on the customer's experience of what you deliver them, and on the business's experience of how much was delivered to the customer. So there are differences. I initially thought, okay, we've got to build software just like BMW builds cars, but it turns out building cars and building software are two different things. If you imagine the way business value flows at BMW, it's pretty obvious because you can actually see the cars. They can see the state of quality by looking at how many cars there are in the rework area. The executives go and count cars, and if there's 20, well, that's too many, and they need to fix the quality of the production line itself. But the business value is clear. It's those quality cars that deliver sheer driving pleasure. They're delivered every 70 seconds, but they're designed in yearly cycles. So that already feels different than what we do with software, because with the cars, the creative process and the manufacturing process are actually decoupled. They're separate processes. And they flow across this linear production line. If the line breaks, no car gets delivered, millions of dollars are lost. If you imagine business value flowing at your organization, at the client organization, what's actually flowing is new business value, so things like new features that delight your customers, that your customers are pulling. But those are designed and delivered in daily cycles or weekly cycles. So it's a much faster creative process. And the creative process and the manufacturing process are one, because the cost of production is basically zero. And they do not flow across the linear production line. So at TaskTop, we've actually visualized many organizations' value streams, and the value streams do not look like linear production. They do not look like a PowerPoint slide of a DevOps CI/CD pipeline. If you actually look at how knowledge flows, it flows across a network that's defined by teams and how those teams are interconnected and how they're connected to the customer, how they're connected to the business strategy. So the flow framework, and this is really the main point of the book, Project to Product, defines what flows in software delivery. So we've not had really this is amazing because I spend a lot of time in computer science research as well. We've not had a common definition of what units of production are in software. We know they're not lines of code because those have problems. I don't think they're deploys per day because nobody really cares how many times you deploy per day. If you don't deploy enough, you probably have a problem. But if you deploy 100 or 1,000 times, the customer probably doesn't notice. All they notice is what you're delivering to them. So I realized that really to get the business side and the IT people on the same page, we needed a new kind of language. And we need a language that was more abstract than things like scaled agile framework, useful as those things are, because again, the CFOs tend to tune out when you tell them about story points and epics and use language that sounds like it's from fairy tales. So in the flow framework, there are only 4 flow items, and these define all business value that flows in software delivery. You can actually envision these laying on top of things like scaled agile framework or data or Nexus. They're features, so these are new business value that's pulled by the customer. There's a benefit to the customer. They're defects. These are quality improvements. So people might want a new release of your software if you fix some quality issues with it. The risks, because things like security, data privacy, PII, those are now a first-class part of software delivery. And then we also have debts. So technical debt improvements, and those are pulled by architects, infrastructure debts, and so on. And these flow items are mutually exclusive and comprehensively exhaustive. So this means that these represent all work that flows in software delivery. Any issue, any ticket, any incident, they can all be mapped into one of these. Any architecture work can go into any of these as an example. So I'll give you a really quick example of how these actually work. When Gene was reviewing the slide deck with me, Gene Kim, he said, Mick, if you can ever show this to IT executives, because I know you want to get the technology people on the same page with the business side and the executive side, you can only show business leaders things with up and down arrows because that's all they understand. So this is my attempt to show this with up and down arrows. So imagine the last time that you had a big push to market. And really, a push to market is the success of it is defined by the feature work, how many features you delivered to that customer. As you do that, debts and risks rise because you're focusing so much on features, you're taking the right kind of shortcuts, hopefully, and so on. And then as that happens, as debts and risks rise, quality goes down, the defect work goes up, and then all of a sudden, you quickly get into this death spiral that I've been in more times I'd like to admit, where defect work will consume all available capacity, feature work goes down to 0. And that's exactly what happened to Nokia. And the business drove Nokia into this. Now, I'll show you a different scenario where a business leader who did understand these technology concepts of there being a zero-sum game between how much risk work you do versus how much technical debt work you do. So this is Bill Gates, who in 2003 released the Trustworthy Computing Memo before security was a front-page issue in our newspapers, right? This is quite a long time ago. But he realized security is important. He said, across all of Microsoft's value streams, we're going to reduce feature work to 0, which no enterprise IT organization CEO has ever said. And we're going to focus on debt work to make Windows and server tools and Office a more secure platform and to do things like Windows Update and so on. And they did that. And then debts and risks went down, quality went up, their feature velocity went up, and Microsoft has actually become the most valuable company in the world based on its software innovation, even though it's got one of the biggest legacy portfolios in the industry, because they've been at it since the 1970s, since the start of the age of software and digital. So the idea with the flow framework is to actually give today's, because not everyone has Bill Gates running their company, someone who's been a software developer and become a CEO. It just so happens that all the tech giants have someone who's been a developer and become a CEO. But to give today's business leaders and technologists a common language to basically look at all software delivery as these value streams, to track these 4 flow metrics and the flow distribution of those 4 flow items, and then to correlate that to business results. So every single value stream, you're tracking things like flow time, how long it takes to go from taking work into a value stream to that work being deployed. Or flow velocity, how many risks you reduced, how much technical debt you reduced, and the distribution of those things, and correlating that to things like value, how much value was provided for this internal or external customer, happiness across the value stream, and the happiness is actually things like the employee net promoter score for the people working on that value stream, not for the customer, but the people doing the work, because we know more engaged people will do better work. So I won't have time to get into the flow metrics right now. So just wrap up, but the book actually details each one of these, and the whole goal of them is to give the technology side and the business side a single language for tracking these value streams and to move away from these basically different silos of languages of the ITIL side, the Agile side, the DevOps side, and the business side. So the idea is that we go away from these silos and proxy metrics into a connected value stream network. We build that network on top of the tool chain. So you basically connect the tool chain with an integration model. You then have a connected graph. You have this artifact model, which has every single ServiceNow ticket, TFS issue, Jira issue, items from your PPM tools, your planning tools, and so on. And we can then inspect that network and derive the flow metrics and align that network not to these projects, but to the products that you're innovating along, with each product having a customer and these business results specified. So you go away from planning being this waterfall with Agile in the middle to a flow orientation for how you plan and how you measure results. You go away from people being assigned to multiple projects to a product-oriented mentality where you never assign a person to more than one product value stream, because you don't give them a chance to master the work for that value stream if you do that. And where you actually have direct visibility into what IT is producing, because you're using a common language of flow, of business value, and optimizing for basically how many features you deliver, optimizing whether this value stream is created for risk reduction or it's created for high learning and needs a cloud-native architecture and code base. So this is not as hard as it seems. So this is just an example of how we've connected our value streams in TaskTop. And from that, we can see these things like the flow metrics. I can see that a feature who's a team where I pushed that team too hard on feature delivery built up mountains of technical debt, which I knew because it was a conscious trade-off. What I didn't realize about that team is how much lower their employee net promoter scores were, because their flow load, how many features they had backlogged, were making them miserable. Just as we now know from records that those Nokia developers were so miserable where they wanted to help Nokia survive, but they couldn't because they were never given a chance to take down that tech debt. So this gave me an early warning indicator that we needed to do that. We needed to give this team a chance to reduce their tech debt. So in summary, the idea is that we go away from these project and cost centers to product value streams, from silos and proxy metrics to flow metrics and business results, and from fragmented value streams to an integrated value stream network. And so to learn more, check out project2product.org. You can get the book in ebook form or audiobook on Amazon. And with that, thank you very much.